year is 52 BC. The place is a lonely, windswept hill in central France, known then as Gaul. And on this hill, one of history's greatest gamblers is about to bet everything he has, his army, his career, his life, and the future of the Roman world, on a single, impossible throw of the dice. Julius Caesar, the man who would be king in all but name, stands on a ridge overlooking a fortified plateau called Alesia. Behind him are 50,000 Roman legionaries, hard men, far from home, tired, muddy, and terrified. But because they aren't just fighting an enemy in front of them, they are fighting a ghost, a shadow, a legend. Inside that fortress on the hill sits Vercingetorix, the young Gallic warlord who has done what no one thought possible. He has united the fractured, warring tribes of Gaul into a single, burning fist of resistance. He has burned his own country to the ground to starve the Romans. He has cut their supply lines. He has beaten Caesar in open battle just weeks before. And now, he sits behind massive stone walls, waiting. But the real nightmare isn't on the hill. It's what is coming from the horizon. Messengers have ridden to the ends of the Celtic world. From the dark forests of the north to the Atlantic coast, the call has gone out. Come to Alesia. Crush the Romans. A relief army is gathering. Not 10,000. Not 20,000. Ancient sources whisper of 250,000 warriors marching to wipe Caesar's legions off the face of the earth. Caesar is trapped. He is the meat in a grinder. Vercingetorix is the anvil. The relief army is the hammer. Most generals would run. Most generals would retreat to the safety of the Roman province and live to fight another day. But Caesar isn't most generals. He looks at the fortress, he looks at the horizon, and he smiles. He doesn't order a retreat. He orders a shovel. If he wins here, Gaul is broken forever. Rome becomes an empire. His name becomes a legend. If he loses, his head ends up on a pike, his men are slaughtered, and Rome burns. This is the story of the siege of Alesia, the moment where one man decided to build a prison for an army and ended up building a prison for himself just to see who would starve first. What would you do in Caesar's boots? Would you run to save your army, or dig in and fight 250,000 warriors on two fronts? Let me know in the comments below. I want to see if we have any Roman tacticians watching. The situation in late 52 BC was a powder keg. For years, Caesar had rampaged through Gaul, conquering tribes, seizing gold, and sending dispatches back to Rome that made him sound like a demigod. But Gaul wasn't dead. It was sleeping. And Vercingetorix woke it up. Vercingetorix wasn't a savage barbarian. He was a sophisticated, tactical genius who had learned warfare watching the Romans. He knew he couldn't beat the Roman legions in a fair fight on an open field. Roman discipline, their heavy armor, their short stabbing swords, it was a machine designed to blend meat. So Vercingetorix stopped playing by Roman rules. He hit and ran. He burned the grain stores. He forced Caesar to chase him through difficult terrain, bleeding the Romans of energy and supplies. Finally, he allowed himself to be trapped at Alesia. It was a bait. He wanted Caesar to pin himself down against the fortress walls, static and vulnerable, while the massive relief army gathered to crush him from behind. It was a perfect trap. But Caesar knew it was a trap. And he walked into it anyway. But because Caesar understood something Vercingetorix didn't. Vercingetorix was betting on numbers. Caesar was betting on engineering. He was betting that his men could move more dirt, build higher walls, and endure more misery than any human beings had a right to. He was betting that a shovel, used correctly, was deadlier than a sword. As the Roman army encircled the hill, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and fear. The legionaries looked up at the walls of Alesia, where 80,000 Gauls screamed insults and waved their weapons. They looked back at the empty horizon, knowing that soon it would be filled with a sea of enemies. And they looked at Caesar, riding his horse in his distinct red cloak, calm, calculating, utterly insane. The stage was set for the greatest siege in antiquity. A battle not just of armies, but of wills. Two men, two nations, two destinies, converging on a single muddy valley in France. And only one was leaving alive. Alesia wasn't just a fort, it was a geological middle finger to any attacking army. It sat on a high, diamond-shaped plateau, protected by steep slopes that were punishing to climb even without someone throwing a javelin at your face. At the base of the hill, two rivers, the Ouse and the Ouse-Rhône, flowed like natural moats. It was a defensive dream. Vercingetorix had crammed 80,000 soldiers into this stronghold, plus the local civilian population. He had food for 30 days. Maybe more if they rationed. He looked down from his ramparts at the Roman ants scurrying below and felt safe. The Romans couldn't storm the heights, it would be suicide. They couldn't starve him out before the relief army arrived. The math was on his side. But Caesar didn't care about math. He cared about geometry. He summoned his engineers. "We're not going to attack," he said. "We're going to build." The order went out, contravallation. It's a fancy military word for a wall that keeps the bad guys inside. But calling what Caesar built a wall is like calling the pyramids a pile of rocks. It was an 11-mile-long masterpiece of cruelty and engineering. The legionaries put down their pila and picked up their delabra, the pickaxe that was as much a part of their kit as their shield. They began to dig, and dig, and dig. First, they dug a trench at the foot of the hill, 20 feet wide with vertical sides. This was the keep-out sign. Its purpose was to prevent sudden surprise attacks while the main works were being built. Behind that, 400 yards back, they dug two more massive ditches, each 15 feet wide and deep. The inner one was filled with water diverted from the rivers. Imagine trying to charge a wall, only to fall into a flooded pit in full armor, drowning in mud while arrows rained down on you. Behind the ditches rose the wall itself, a 12-foot-high rampart of packed earth, strengthened with timber. On top of that, a wooden palisade. Every 80 feet, a 3-story watchtower loomed, bristling with scorpions and ballistae, massive crossbows that could punch a bolt through a man and the horse he was riding on. But Caesar wasn't done. He knew the Gauls were brave. He knew they would try to rush the walls. So he turned the killing zone in front of the wall into a horror's cape of hidden traps. He planted rows of sharpened branches called sippi, interwoven so they couldn't be pulled up. He dug pits called lilia, lilies, which sounds pretty, but were actually funnel-shaped holes with a fire-hardened stake at the bottom, covered with brush. Step on a lily, and the stake went through your foot and impaled your leg. You were pinned, screaming, an easy target for archers. And in front of those? Stimuli. Iron hooks buried in the ground, designed to snag feet and rip ankles apart. It was a meat grinder waiting for meat. Vercingetorix watched this ring of death closing around him with growing horror. He tried to stop it. He sent his cavalry thundering down the slopes, desperate to break the construction crews. It was a savage, chaotic clash. Roman legionaries dropped their shovels, grabbed their shields, and formed lines in the mud. Germanic mercenaries, savage horsemen Caesar had hired from across the Rhine, countercharged the Gauls. Dust, blood, and the screams of horses filled the valley. But the Roman line held. The German cavalry broke the Gauls, chasing them back up the slopes to the safety of their walls. The gate slammed shut. The trap was closed. Vercingetorix was sealed in. But before the final gap was plugged, he had done something brilliant and desperate. He had sent his cavalry away. Not to fight, but to run. "Go to the tribes," he told them. "Tell them Caesar is here. Tell them to come now, or Gaul dies." Caesar watched the riders slip through the lines in the dead of night. He knew what it meant. The timer had started. The relief army was coming. Now Caesar faced the ultimate problem. He had a wall facing inward to keep Vercingetorix in. But what happens when 250,000 angry Gauls show up behind him? He would be pinned against his own fortifications, crushed like a bug against a windshield. A lesser man would have packed up and left. He would have said, "Well, we tried," and marched back to the province. Caesar? Caesar said, "Build another wall." This was the circumvallation. If the first wall was a prison, The second wall was a fortress. It faced outward, away from Alesia, creating a donut of safety for the Romans. This outer ring was 14 miles long. 14 miles of ditches, ramparts, towers, and traps. Think about the scale of this. In a matter of weeks, without modern machinery, the Roman army moved millions of tons of earth. They felled entire forests. They built a fortified city from scratch, in the middle of hostile territory, while being constantly attacked. It is a feat of logistics and endurance that boggles the mind. Caesar's army was now living in a corridor between two walls. They were besieging Alesia, and they were being besieged by Gaul. It was a double siege, a stalemate of starvation. Inside the Roman lines, life was a discipline of misery. Rations were cut. Sleep was a luxury. Men slept in their armor, gripping their swords. Every sound from the forest, a snapping twig, a hooting owl, made sentries jump. They knew the horde was out there, gathering like a storm front. And inside Alesia, things were getting desperate. Vercingetorix had 80,000 soldiers to feed, plus the civilians. The grain stores were dwindling. The livestock was gone. The smell of unburied bodies and sickness began to drift through the streets of the Oppidum. Vercingetorix, the hero of Gaul, had to make a choice that would stain his soul forever. The food was for the fighters. The useless mouths, the women, the children, the elderly, the sick, had to go. One grim morning, the gates of Alesia opened. The pitiful procession shuffled out. Thousands of civilians, weeping, begging, walking down the slopes toward the Roman lines. They thought the Romans would let them pass. They thought Caesar, a civilized man, would have mercy. They reached the Roman ditch and looked up at the sentries. "Let us through," they cried. "Take us as slaves, just feed us." Caesar looked down from his tower. He saw the starving women. He saw the crying children. And he shook his head. No, he couldn't feed them. He couldn't let them go to tell the relief army his weaknesses. He couldn't risk his own men for the enemy's civilians. So the gates of the Roman wall remained shut. The civilians turned back to Alesia, begging Vercingetorix to let them back in. But the gates of Alesia remained shut too. Vercingetorix couldn't feed them either. And so, in the no-man's land between the armies, thousands of innocents sat down in the mud and died. They starved to death in full view of their husbands and fathers on the walls, and the Roman soldiers on the ramparts. It was a horror that hardened the hearts of every man on that field. It signaled that the time for mercy was over. This was a war of extermination. As the cries of the dying faded and a terrifying silence fell over the valley, a low rumble began to shake the earth. Not thunder, not an earthquake. It was the sound of footsteps. 250,000 pairs of feet. The relief army had arrived. And Caesar was about to find out if his walls were strong enough to hold back the tide. The arrival of the relief army was like a scene from a nightmare. First came the dust, a brown haze that blotted out the sun. Then the noise, a cacophony of horns, drums, and the chanting of 250,000 warriors. They filled the horizon. They covered the hills like a living carpet. The Commius, the Gallic commander of the relief force, had brought together the might of every tribe. The Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani. It was the greatest army Gaul had ever assembled. Inside Alesia, the starving defenders dragged themselves to the walls. When they saw their kinsmen, a roar went up, a ragged, desperate cheer that echoed off the valley walls. Vercingetorix ordered his men to prepare. The time for waiting was over. For Caesar's men, the sight was terrifying. They were outnumbered 5-1. Maybe more. They were tired, hungry, and dirty. But they were Romans. They checked their straps. They sharpened their pila. They looked to their centurions, those rock-hard veterans with transverse crests on their helmets, and they held the line. The battle began with a cavalry engagement on the plain. The Gallic relief cavalry swept forward, thousands of them, clashing with Caesar's Germanic horsemen. It was a brutal, swirling melee in the dust. Infantry from the relief army mixed in with the cavalry, trying to stab the Roman horses. But the Germans fought with savage ferocity, and the Roman discipline held. The Gallic cavalry was driven back. Strike one for Caesar. But the Gauls were just testing the waters. The real storm broke the next night. Under the cover of darkness, the relief army launched a massive assault on the outer wall. They came screaming out of the blackness, carrying ladders, hurdles to cover the trenches, and grappling hooks. "To the walls! To the walls!" The cry went up in the Roman camps. Legionaries scrambled from their tents, sleep still in their eyes, grabbing their shields. The air filled with the hiss of arrows and the thud of sling stones. At the same moment, Vercingetorix saw the attack. He ordered his drums to beat. The gates of Alesia burst open, and his starving warriors poured down the hill to attack the inner wall. The Romans were hit from both sides. Imagine the chaos. In the dark, lit only by flickering torches and the flashes of artillery fire. To your front, thousands of Gauls are trying to climb your wall. To your back, 100 yards away, thousands more are trying to smash through the other wall. The noise is deafening. The confusion is absolute. The Roman artillery, the scorpions and ballistae, worked overtime. Huge bolts punched through ranks of attackers. But the Gauls were fearless. They threw bundles of brush into the ditches to bridge them. They threw themselves onto the stakes to create bridges of bodies for their comrades. They reached the palisades. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted on the ramparts. Romans stabbed downward with their gladius swords. Gauls hacked upward with their long swords. Men fell screaming into the ditches. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, yes, that Mark Antony, rode back and forth with reserve cohorts, plugging gaps in the line. Hold here. Push them back. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. The sheer weight of numbers threatened to snap the thin Roman line. But the engineering held. The traps took their toll. The ditches broke the momentum of the charges. The walls forced the Gauls to fight uphill. As dawn broke, the exhausted Gauls fell back. The field was littered with bodies. The Romans collapsed where they stood, gasping for air, drinking water mixed with vinegar. They had survived, but barely. The Gauls realized that blind charges against the walls weren't working. They needed a weak spot. And they found one. To the north of the Roman position, there was a hill, Montre, that was too large to be included in the circumvallation. The Roman line had to run along the lower slope of this hill. It was a flaw, a gap in the perfection. If the Gauls could take the high ground above the wall, they could rain missiles down on the Romans and smash through. The Gallic commanders gathered their best troops, 60,000 chosen warriors sworn to conquer or die. They moved them secretly behind the hills, hiding them in the forests. They waited for noon. At midday, the hammer fell. 60,000 Gauls poured down the slope of Montre, hitting the weak northern section of the Roman wall like a landslide. At the same time, the rest of the relief army attacked the southern walls to pin the Romans down. And Vercingetorix, seeing the strategy, threw everything he had at the inner walls. It was a three-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the Roman command. The fighting at the northern wall was desperate. The Romans were fighting uphill against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1 in that sector. The Gauls filled the ditches with earth and fascines. They tore at the palisades with hooks. They swarmed over the ramparts. Labienus, Caesar's most trusted general, was in command of the north. He sent a runner to Caesar. "We are breaking. I cannot hold." Caesar was at his command post, watching the disaster unfold. He could see his lines buckling. He could see the standards wavering. This was it, the moment where empires are made or lost. He grabbed a cohort of reinforcements. Then another. He stripped men from the quiet sectors. "Follow me," he said. And then he did something that would be etched into history. He put on his scarlet cloak, the polydamentum, a bright, blood-red garment that marked him as the commander-in-chief. In the dust and chaos of battle, it shone like a beacon. He wasn't hiding. He was telling his men, "I am here. I die with you." He rode toward the northern breach. The legionaries, exhausted, bleeding, on the verge of panic, looked up. They saw the red cloak. They saw their general riding into the teeth of the enemy. A roar went up from the Roman lines. Not of fear, but of fury. The men stopped retreating. They slammed their shields together. They drew their swords. The final clash had begun. The scene at the northern wall was apocalyptic. The air was so thick with javelins and arrows it looked like a hailstorm. The noise was a physical blow, the screaming of men, the clash of iron, the splintering of wood. Caesar arrived at the critical moment. The Gauls had breached the rampart. They were inside the fortifications. Labienus was fighting with his back to the wall, his men forming a desperate shield wall. Caesar didn't just send in reinforcements. He led them. "Look at him," the centurion shouted. "The general is watching." The presence of Caesar acted like an electric shock. Men who were too tired to stand suddenly found the strength to charge. They hurled their pila into the mass of Gauls and then drew their gladii, stabbing, punching, shield-bashing. It was brutal, intimate violence. But Caesar had one more card to play. A card he had been holding for this exact moment. Before he joined the fray, he had ordered his Germanic cavalry to leave the fortifications, ride wide around the hill, and attack the Gallic relief force from the rear. As the Gauls pressed forward, thinking victory was inches away, they heard a new sound behind them. The thunder of hooves. The blare of trumpets. They turned and saw the Roman cavalry crashing into their unprotected backs. Panic is a contagion. It spreads faster than fire. The Gauls at the rear screamed and tried to run. The Gauls at the front, still fighting the Romans, felt the pressure from behind disappear. They wavered. Caesar saw the hesitation. "Now," he roared. "Push them." The legions surged forward. The hammer and the anvil snapped shut. The 60,000 chosen warriors of Gaul were trapped between the Roman infantry and the Roman cavalry. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. The Gallic formation disintegrated. Warriors threw down their weapons and ran. But there was nowhere to run. The cavalry cut them down as they fled. The slaughter stretched for miles. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the disaster unfold. He saw the relief army, his last hope, his miracle, break like a wave against a cliff and dissolve into foam. He saw the red cloak of Caesar dominating the battlefield. He turned away from the ramparts. He knew. It was over. The relief army melted away. The tribes, seeing the slaughter of their best warriors, lost heart. They packed up their camps and vanished into the forests, leaving Alesia to its fate. That night, a terrible silence fell over the valley. The screaming had stopped. The moaning of the wounded replaced the war cries. Inside Alesia, the council of chieftains met. Vercingetorix stood before them. He was calm. He didn't beg. "I did this for the freedom of Gaul," he said. "But fortune has not been with us. I am the cause of this war. Give me to the Romans. Kill me, or hand me over alive, to appease their anger. Save yourselves." The next morning, the gates of Alesia opened one last time. A lone figure rode out. Vercingetorix. He was dressed in his finest armor, his horse groomed and decorated with silver. He didn't look like a defeated prisoner. He looked like a king. He rode down the hill, through the Roman lines, past the silent, staring legionaries. He rode straight to where Caesar sat on a folding chair, surrounded by his lictors and generals. Vercingetorix dismounted. He took off his armor, piece by piece, and laid it on the ground. He placed his sword at Caesar's feet. Then he knelt. He didn't say a word. Caesar didn't say a word. The two greatest men of their age looked at each other. One had fought for freedom, the other for power. One had lost everything, the other had won the world. Guards stepped forward. They chained Vercingetorix's hands and feet. They dragged him away. He would spend the next 6 years in a dark Roman dungeon, waiting to be paraded through the streets of Rome in Caesar's triumph, and then strangled to death. A tragic end for a hero. But such is the price of losing to Rome. The surrender at Alesia wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. It was the death of Celtic Gaul and the birth of Roman France. The consequences were staggering. 1 million Gauls had been killed in the war. Another 1 million were sold into slavery. Entire tribes were wiped off the map. The culture of the Druids, the oral traditions, the tribal independence, it was all crushed under the Roman sandal. But from the ashes, something new arose. Gallo-Roman culture. Cities replaced hill forts. Latin replaced the Celtic tongues. Roads, aqueducts, and amphitheaters sprang up across the land. Gaul became the wealthiest and most stable province of the empire, the jewel in Rome's crown. For Caesar, Alesia was the key to the universe. The wealth he looted paid off his massive debts. The glory he won made him the idol of the Roman people. The army he forged in the fires of Alesia, the legendary 10th Legion, the 13th, the others, became blindly loyal to him, not to the Senate. When the Senate ordered him to disband his army and come home, Caesar remembered Alesia. He remembered what his men could do. He remembered that impossible victory. And he said, "The die is cast." He crossed the Rubicon, marched on Rome, and ended the Republic, becoming the first emperor in all but title. Alesia changed the world. If Caesar had lost, Rome might have remained a Mediterranean power, never expanding north. French, Spanish, Portuguese, the Romance languages, might not exist. The history of Europe would have been completely rewritten. But beyond the history, there is the human story. The siege of Alesia is a testament to the terrifying power of human will. It shows us what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. It shows us the brilliance of strategy, the cruelty of war, and the tragedy of defeat. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest walls aren't the ones we build to keep people out, but the ones we build to keep ourselves in, forcing us to fight with a desperation that conquers the impossible. Caesar's strategy was a gamble of lunacy. But as they say, fortune favors the bold. So, what do you think? Was Caesar a military genius, or a lucky gambler who should have been crushed? And poor Vercingetorix, did he deserve a better fate? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's wildest sieges, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got more epic battles coming your way. And speaking of which, where should we go next? Should we cover the icy hell of Napoleon's retreat from Russia? The shield walls of the Vikings? Or maybe the last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.